Hi, in this video, we'll learn how to play Behind Enemy Lines, a fan-made solo adventure for Scythe. This video will assume you already know how to play Scythe, so we'll just focus on what's different in this solo puzzle. First, set up Rusviet as normal. The only difference is that when you set up Rusviet, you're already going to deploy all 4 mechs. Place them near Rusviet's home base. This means you'll immediately gain access to all 4 mech abilities, but you won't be able to achieve the mech star. Your opponent in this adventure are the combined forces of Polonia and Saxony, so you'll take 3 of Polonia's mechs and 3 of Saxony's mechs, along with either Polonia or Saxony's character, and set them up on the first hex on the left side of the board, furthest away from Rusviet's home base, as you see here. Your goal in this solo adventure is to rescue Crimea and Nordic prisoners of war. So you'll set up 3 of each near Polonia's home base. You're also going to have to pay a bribe when you rescue them. That bribe can change in the setup of this game. So you'll place a token representing the resource that you need to use for the bribe near the prisoners. The only other things to do for the Alliance is to use Polonia's tokens. You'll put Polonia's popularity token on the 5 space, Polonia's power token on the 3 space, and you'll want to pull out a few of Polonia's stars. The rest of the board is set up as normal, with the exception that you'll use the structures on tunnel spaces structural bonus card. Everything else, objectives, factory cards, encounter tokens, etc., are all set up normally. Your goal will be to rescue all 6 prisoners, delivering the Crimea prisoners to Crimea's home base and delivering the Nordic prisoners to Nordic's home base before the Alliance becomes too powerful. If you do that, you win the game. Your turn is a normal turn in a game of Scythe. You do all the things that you can normally do, with 2 exceptions. One is that you don't have to worry about Riverwalk. All your units can move across all rivers, but they can't move through lakes. The other exception is that you can't use tunnels for movement. The alliances block the tunnels. So you can move across the board more easily than in a normal game of Scythe, but you can't jump between tunnels. For the Alliance's turn, we're going to use the automa cards that come with a game of Scythe. In fact, you only need the base game of Scythe to play this game. However, we're only going to use a small subset of the automa card features. On the Alliance's turn, you'll draw a card, and we'll look at the number of combat cards that appear in the combat area of the automa card. Then we'll move every Alliance unit that number of spaces. For example, here there are 3 combat cards, so the units will move at most 3 spaces. Moving the Alliance units is very simple. They cross all rivers and through lakes. They just march back and forth across the board in the same row. So for 3 spaces, I'll move 3 spaces for every unit. And let's imagine that I had a unit along the way. Then the Alliance will stop on that same area if it meets one of my units along the way. The bottommost unit will also turn into this hex and then continue along its way in the same row, and it will do the same when it comes back the other direction. When the unit hits the end of the row, it's simply going to turn around and come back the other direction. Combat won't begin until after all the units have been moved. Then you'll resolve combat. Notice, though, that the character reached the factory. Whenever the character reaches the factory as it goes back and forth, 2 things happen. The Alliance bolsters, gaining 3 power, and the Alliance loses 1 popularity. Popularity is a countdown. If it ever reaches 0, you lose. You can push the Alliance's popularity back up by adding stars. Every time you get a star, move the Alliance's popularity up 1. In this way, you can push back against the countdown. The character will also stop on the factory, just like all the other units stop when they meet one of your units. The Alliance units also won't enter the 3 hexes in front of Rusviet's home base. They stop, turn around, and go back the other direction. If there are no combat cards shown on the Automa card, then the Alliance instead bolsters and gains 3 power. In this way, you can't simply block the character from hitting the factory, because eventually it will have enough power that it will beat you in combat. One last note, if the Alliance units encounter any of your unprotected resources, then those resources are gone and lost, and you lose 1 popularity. If the Alliance encounters any unprotected or unhidden workers, then they'll be sent back to Rusviet's home base. But to talk about protection and the rest of that, we need to talk about the way that you win the game. Let's talk about prisoners. Prisoners represent large groups, and they can't be moved on their own. In order to rescue them, you'll have to use a special ability that all your units have. All your units can enter and leave all home bases on the board. However, they can't take resources with them. In order to rescue a prisoner, you'll have to move a mech onto Polonia's home base and then transport a prisoner out with you. A mech can only transport 1 prisoner, although it can transport as many workers along with that prisoner as you like. However, for a prisoner to leave Polonia's home base, 2 things have to happen. 1, you'll have to pay a bribe. The price is based on setup plus your current popularity. See the rulebook for details. The other thing is that the 6 prisoners match up to 6 stars that you'll need to achieve. For every prisoner that leaves Polonia's home base, you'll need to have achieved at least 1 star per prisoner. You can do this in any order. For example, you could achieve 5 stars and then begin rescuing prisoners. Or you could do 1 prisoner for every star you achieve. That's up to you. But however many prisoners are on the board that have left Polonia's home base, you need to have at least that many stars achieved. So at the moment that you move your mech along with the prisoner, that star requirement must be true, and at that moment, you must pay the bribe. And you'll pay the bribe for every prisoner that leaves Polonia's home base. You'll then be in charge of getting that prisoner all the way to their respective home base. And you'll be able to do that again with your mech by transporting the prisoner to the home base and getting them onto the home base. Once a prisoner has reached its home base, it's considered rescued and cannot re-enter the game. Prisoners that are on hexes behave as workers. They can produce resources, but they can't help with combat. And again, they can't move on their own. There is one exception, though, to them moving on their own. The exception is that any structures you've built that match the structural bonus card criteria, by default structures on tunnels, act as a kind of prisoner underground. This is the only way that prisoners can move on their own. They can move between your structures that match the bonus card, but they can't move on their own other than that. They'll have to be transported by a mech. Another thing to note is that all tunnels on the board act as hiding places for workers and prisoners, assuming they're not accompanied by a mech or your character. That means that when Alliance units pass through that tunnel territory, they simply ignore your workers and the prisoners. But those units will still clear out any resources that you have on the hex. Combat is resolved almost identically to a normal solo game of Scythe. Once all unit movement is completed, then you resolve the combats in any order that you want. You set your power as normal. Then the Alliance sets its power using the Automa card. You draw a card, and you use the combat section of the card to determine how much power the Alliance will use. You also look at the combat cards in the combat section. If there are any combat cards, then draw 1 combat card to add to the Alliance's power. That means if there are 2 or 3 combat icons shown, you still only draw 1 combat card. If you lose the combat, then you go home as normal. However, the Alliance will not lose popularity for winning combat ever. If the Alliance loses combat, then wherever that unit is, it's moved back to its original starting location, laid on its side, and you place a Polonia marker next to it. It will look like this. When the unit loses combat, it also loses a turn. Any units laying on their side are completely ignored by you, as if they weren't there on the board. The unit is recovering. On the Alliance's next turn, when other units move, stand up any units that are lying on their side. The unit won't move this turn. On the next turn of the Alliance, you'll remove the star. The star is a reminder of which units are still inactive. You'll remove the star, and then move the unit as normal immediately on that turn. If there are prisoners on the hex when combat begins, and you lose, then after you go home, that prisoner is now captured, and will begin moving with the Alliance unit. Once the Alliance unit reaches back to its original starting position, that prisoner is recaptured and put back on Polonia's base. However, while the unit is moving with the captured prisoner, you can engage with it in combat again, and if you win, then you'll re-rescue that prisoner. You have another option when combat begins, and that is to provide cover. You can move all prisoners onto an adjacent legal non-lake hex before combat begins, and then begin resolving the combat. And that's it. That's how to play behind enemy lines. You'll be achieving stars, which will help you rescue prisoners, as well as push back on Polonia's popularity countdown. At the same time, Polonia's character will be reaching the factory, pushing that countdown further and further to 0. If you can rescue all 6 prisoners before the timer runs out, you win. Scythe is normally an area control game. This scenario turns it into more of a timing and avoidance game. If you give it a try, you'll see what I mean. Have fun!